see a little girl cry. Jim Danny to the rescue. Go, Jim Danny. Go, Jim Danny. Jim Danny to the rescue. Jim Danny to the rescue. Jim Danny to the rescue. Go, Jim Danny.
I'll call the meeting of April 1st, 2008 of the City Council Ordinance Committee to order. First, we'll take public comment for any items not on the agenda. We have any public comment for items not on the agenda. And then second, a presentation on the inclusionary housing ordinance revisions. Mr. Volstich.
Good afternoon, Chair Williams and members of the Ordinance Committee. My name is Stephen Falstich. I'm the Housing Program Supervisor for the City of Santa Barbara in the Community Development Department. The Council last considered changes to the inclusionary ordinance at its meeting in August of 2007. Council reviewed the recommendations of the Housing Policy Steering Committee and of the Planning Commission at that time, and Council decided not to implement a couple of the major recommendations. Specifically, Council chose not to increase the required percentage of inclusionary units in affordable housing in housing projects from 15% to 20% or some higher number. They decided to cap it at the current 15% requirement. And actually, I shouldn't say that that was a final decision. What they said is that they didn't want to make changes at that time, that they could consider changes to increase the inclusionary percentage, but wanted that to be part of the larger discussion of the changes to the city's general plan, which of course is going on right now. And Council did forward one significant change, though, to the Ordinance Committee, and that's what we're going to be considering today. I'll start with a summary of the current ordinance as it was adopted in 2004 and still exists. The ordinance applies only to subdivisions or condominium conversions, which is a subdivision. It does not apply to rental units. And it says that for every project of 10 or more ownership units, it will apply, and that 15% of the units in the project have to be affordable. And that's rounded to the nearest whole number, and that the project will be entitled to a density bonus for any required inclusionary units. So, for example, a 10-unit project would have a 1.5 unit inclusionary requirement, which would round to 2 units, and those units, if they were provided on site, would be entitled to density bonus, and the developer could build 12 units on site, 2 of which would be affordable. And the other option would be to pay an in lieu fee for one or both of those units. The affordability is different than you'd see in most jurisdictions. So the city agreed or chose to target the affordability for these to middle income households. Most affordable housing that's counted by the state is very low, low, or moderate income housing. So this is higher than that. A 2-bedroom unit would sell for about $250,000. Buyers could have incomes up to 160% of area median income, which is published by HUD every year. And that means that 2 persons could earn up to $83,500. It's adjusted by household size. And that a household would qualify with an income of $70,400 with a 10% down payment and current mortgage rates. In adopting the ordinance in 2004, Council made certain findings and set forth certain goals. One important finding is that new market rate housing, including condo conversions, brings new residents to the city, and this increases the demand for new services. Service providers who are middle income can't afford to buy homes here, and if they want to be home buyers, they may feel forced to commute long distances. And in fact, we're seeing a lot of long commutes every day into Santa Barbara. 90% of the city's affordable housing is for low-income renters. We have a very effective long-term affordable housing program. Council has been committed for 30 years to provision of that, but 90% of it has been for low-income renters. There's a big need for housing affordable to middle-income households, but the subsidies aren't available. And again, all of these are listed in the ordinance as findings and goals. And the question is, are the goals being met as well as possible? Some have questioned whether the ordinance goes far enough in furthering its stated goals. Should the threshold be lowered? That's the big question before you today. As I said, that there's a threshold currently at 10 units or more, but of the, I think it's going on 200 municipalities in the state of California, 60% that have inclusionary housing requirements, 60% of them do have a threshold lower than 10 units, and half of those have thresholds of between 1 and 4 units. The staff is recommending, and this actually comes, that was forwarded to Ordinance Committee by City Council, to lower the project size threshold from 10 units to 2 units. And the staff's recommendation is to reduce the inclusionary percentage for these smaller projects from the 15% that applies to projects of 10 or more units to only 5% for projects of 2 through 9 units. And projects would be required to pay a proportional in lieu fee. Now, this is different than council forwarded on to your committee, and staff has changed the recommendation in the meantime. And the main reason for the change is to speed the environmental review of this. The idea is that there are some changes that could be done outside of the general plan update process that council members would look at as improvements to the ordinance. And if there was a 5% requirement, then a 9-unit project would, 5% of 9 units is 0.45. 5 times 9 is 45, so it would be 0.45 of a unit, which would mean that it would be less than half a unit that's required. And so staff is proposing that it be limited to 5%. There would be no new housing units required as a part of this. The only option would be the payment of the prorated in lieu fee, or the developer could apply to build that extra unit, but there would be no density bonus by right for these projects of fewer than 10 units. So basically it would be more cost effective for the developer to pay the prorated in lieu fee. And if it were a 10% requirement, basically what council heard and forwarded was that for projects of 2, 3, or 4 units, there'd be a 5% requirement, and for projects of 5 through 9 units, there'd be a 10% requirement. Well, the 10% requirement of a 9-unit project would be 0.9 units, meaning that there would be a requirement to build an affordable housing unit. There would be a density bonus by right offered, and that would increase the number of units. Because that change to the ordinance would increase the number of units, the environmental review would be more complicated because there's more of an environmental impact from the extra units. So by limiting the proposed change now to only 5%, there would be no requirement through the ordinance to provide more units, and it would just be a matter of payment of fees. And so that's why staff has revised the recommendation, and that's the recommendation before you. Another important thing that council forwarded on to the ordinance committee was that the revision of the calculation of the in lieu fee. And this is because in the last 4 years, the in lieu fee calculation as specified in the ordinance, there's a formula in the ordinance, and because of the high increase in housing costs in the city in that time, the in lieu fee has increased from $310,000 in 2004 to a current amount of $473,000. And staff is recommending that there's a one-word change to the ordinance that would lower the result of that calculation to an in lieu fee of $354,000. And that would basically be in the formula, change the word low income to moderate income. I won't go through this table in detail unless you have questions, but it's in the staff report. Basically, the in lieu fee calculation in the ordinance is the difference between the development cost of a two-bedroom condo in the city and the affordable sale price of a low-income unit. And that results in the current $473,000. If we say that instead it's the difference between the development cost of a two-bedroom condo and the affordable price of a moderate income unit, that lowers the in lieu fee to $354,000 per unit. And this isn't a change that's absolutely essential. If you do nothing, the in lieu fee stays at $473,000. But it's a change that staff feels would be more in line with the in lieu fee that council expected when they developed, introduced and adopted the ordinance. So the in lieu fee at $354,000 would still be high enough to encourage construction of the units on site, and it'd be large enough to be very useful in furthering the city's affordable housing goals if the fee was collected. Courts have upheld inclusionary ordinances in part because in lieu fees have been offered as an option, and a lower fee may be more legally defensible than a fee of $473,000. That's just a thought. This is another important recommendation by staff, and that's that we expand the permitted uses of the in lieu fees. Actually, under the current ordinance, no in lieu fees have been collected. Developers have chosen to pay the fee. But if we do this revision and apply a prorated in lieu fee requirement for 2 through 9 units, we're going to start seeing some payment of fees. And
you had meant to say that they had chosen to build the units, not pay the fee. Correct?
I'm sorry, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
So all of the developers have chosen to build the units rather than pay the fee, but we'll start seeing more developers choose to pay the fee if the requirement extends below 10 units. And one of the uses, currently the ordinance says that all of the collected in lieu fees have to be used for the subsidizing low and moderate income housing. So one thing we want to do is expand that to allow us to subsidize middle income housing, such as the proposed Las Portales project that's over by Casa de la Raza. The development costs of those units bring them out of the middle and upper middle income range, and staff has real concerns with going above the adopted affordability range. But if we collected in lieu fees and allowed the use to subsidize some of the middle and upper middle, that could be very helpful. So we recommend that the in lieu fees be permitted to be used for buying back any middle or upper middle income units that are in default. We do that now with moderate income units, but we need that ability to do for middle and upper middle. And what happens is then when the city resells the unit, we get that money back. So also subsidizing the development of middle and upper middle income, as I mentioned, and paying the staff costs for administering the inclusionary program. Our staff costs now are paid through mainly the redevelopment agency moderate income funds, and really aren't allowed to be used for administration of the middle income projects. So this would be a very important change from staff's perspective. Here's what the in lieu fees would look like if the in lieu fee adjustment were made and it was down to $350-some thousand per unit. The 5% inclusionary requirement for a 2-unit project would be a 10% of the $354,000 in lieu fee, or a total of $35,400. Basically what this boils down to is that there would be a fee of $17,700 per unit for projects of 2 through 9 units. There's some other changes that staff's recommending. In employer-sponsored housing projects, a lot of those have upper middle income units included, and currently those would be subject to an inclusionary requirement as well, and it really doesn't make sense. They're affordable units, and so we would ask that the ordinance be amended to exclude those upper middle income from counting toward inclusionary. For projects of 2, 3, or 4 units, these small development, we could delay the due date for the payment of the inclusion of the in lieu fee, so that it's just prior to occupancy rather than prior to the issuance of building permit. We see some smaller mom and pop type developers of these small condo projects, and the timing of the payment of the fee could be a hardship because they have to borrow that money and keep it all during the, pay interest on it all during the development process. So generally we want to see it prior to issuance of building permit, because that's when the city really has some leverage. If the project is all built, it's harder to withhold occupancy than it is to withhold a building permit. So we would just ask for a exception to that for small units. And also, currently the minimum number of bedrooms in the inclusionary units has to be equal to the average number of bedrooms in the market rate units, and sometimes if there's 10 two-bedroom units and 1 3-bedroom unit, that means that half of the inclusionary of the 2 inclusionary units has to be a 3-bedroom unit, and some developers have said that's kind of a hardship. So we could just change that to allow discretion on a case-by-case basis, and just any other minor changes that you deem appropriate. Some concerns are that the in lieu fee will be a hardship on smaller projects, but for 2 through 9 units, actually, it's $17,000 per market rate unit. And I think a lot of the condo conversions and the new construction can easily afford to pay that fee. For instance, the new condo, the average median listing price of new condos through the multiple listing service right now is $1.3 million. And this would only be 1.4% of the total price of the unit. And also, we have 20 projects now of 2 to 4 units that are pending, and that totals 58 units. These are all units that are having an impact on the city's on demand for affordable housing, but currently are doing nothing to offset that. 58 units times 17,700 is over $1 million that the city could use for its affordable housing goals. So here's a summary of the recommended changes, and I'll just keep this up there for discussion. Revise the in lieu fee, lower the threshold from 10 units to 2 units. Apply the $17,700 per unit in lieu fee for projects of 2 through 9 units. Allow in lieu fees to be used for buying back units that are in default, subsidizing middle and upper middle income housing for local employees, paying for administrative costs of the inclusionary program. Also exempting upper middle income units and employer-sponsored projects. Delay the payment of the in lieu fee until occupancy for 2, 3, or 4 unit projects. Revise the calculation of minimum number of bedrooms, and that's that. So that concludes my presentation.
First, do we have any questions from committee members? Mr. House?
It's for Mr. Vincent. On one of those last points, it had to do with the speaking to units that are pending. And the question I have is, when a new ordinance is being crafted and then ultimately if it's approved by the city council, and I believe it goes into effect like 30 days after its the final approval at city council, how does that affect projects that have been in the development review pipeline up until that point? I mean, ones that have already received their final approval from ABR or wherever, they would have already gotten through. But what about the ones that are in the works at this time?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission or committee, to answer Councilmember House's question, the Subdivision Map Act sets this timing, and that timing is at the time that the application is deemed complete. The project at that point is subject to the rules and regulations in effect as of the date of completeness.
So to take from that, we'll use this as an example. The 58 units and 20 projects of 2 to 4 units are pending. If those that have complete applications would not then be subject to this if their applications were complete prior to the 30-day period after the final approval of the City Council.
That's correct.
Thank you. Just wanted to clarify. We had someone who wrote us a letter that was very concerned about that, and I just wanted to get that cleared up. Thank you.
Any other questions from committee members? And we'll take public comment. I would only ask one thing, that in addition to, I'm sure, the speaking against and in support of inclusionary housing in concept, that speakers could help guide this committee's deliberation on the specific changes being recommended as well, not just general comments on the subject. Mr. Bunin, followed by Judy Reyes.
Jerry Bunin, Government Affairs Director, Home Builders Association. I'm going to go down, but I didn't get the same order that Stephen had. So we support lowering the threshold to 2 units, but we really do think it's probably the wrong time given market conditions. It's just really getting hard to make housing make any sense at all to build right now. So I think that the net effect on that, you might see fewer homes being built, not more affordable homes. Even at $18,000 for 2 to 9, that's still a lot more money than people are paying. We really believe that you should spread the burden even further than going from 2 to 9. You got 37,000 homes, and you're only adding 100 new homes every year. It's really tough making those homes carry the full burden of your affordable program. And I don't even know what percentage of those homes that are being permitted are actually going through your housing authority. I think the actual number of market rate homes in this community is probably about 50 a year going back to 1990. I do know there's 100 permits a year on average since then. I can't say that we don't support lowering the in lieu fee from $475,000 to $350,000, but if you take a 10-unit project with a 15% inclusionary requirement and a $350,000 in lieu fee per affordable unit, you're adding $500,000 in cost to that project. It's a non-starter. Is it better than $700,000? Yeah. Is it still toxic? Yeah. No one building a 10-unit project will ever take that option. There's no way to recoup it. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, maybe it's legally defensible. It's not viable. We support the first 2 under expanding the use of the in lieu fees. You know, I'm a big advocate of seeing I'm an advocate of affordable housing. I believe that it's a community value, but nobody in government ever asks the community to contribute. That money should come out of the general fund. There should be some way to get the 37,000 homes and all the businesses who work here to contribute something to your affordable housing program instead of taking those fees. And as valuable as I think Stephen is as an employee, I don't think he should be paid out of those in lieu fees. We do support the goal of creating affordable housing, but I really think this is the wrong solution, inclusionary. I know you want me to stay off of that. But the problem is that you've got very few units trying to do a lot. Very small pie, and the concept is that if I divide the pie up even more, I can feed more people. All you're going to do is whet the appetite for more people. You're not going to feed them. The solution is to build a bigger pie. No one ever likes to hear this, but the solutions are building height and building density. And until you get there, trying to squeeze more blood out of a few units isn't going to cut it. So, thank you very much.
Judy Reyes, followed by Joe Ruchon.
Hi. I'm here speaking as president of the Allied Neighborhood Association. I believe you received a letter from it. I'd like to just summarize a few things. We had a subcommittee that worked on this letter, and some of the basic things that they feel that the program has failed in its basic purpose, and it has led to some very negative unintended consequences. And the ordinance itself makes the job housing balance worse. The ordinance fails to provide any new needed workforce housing, and it also produces projects that are too big for the community. The Neighborhood Association feels that this ordinance should be put and folded into the planned Santa Barbara process, and they oppose the needing of lot area modifications, and I would like to make a few personal comments. And some of them may be a little bit off the topic, but I'd like to talk about. It's still the American dream to own a house, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. And one of the things that I've noticed in the years that I've lived here, that we seem not to be addressing the needs of the young professionals of tomorrow. And so I see that the units that we now put in are not attractive to the young professionals of tomorrow or today, and then we have the large commute into the city from areas where they can have the housing that they desire. The units that we are building require services and people to perform those services, and they in turn want housing, and they in turn are commuting in. So we're in a catch-22 situation. I'm concerned about the loss of the rental units to condominiums. I see that we are losing the balance in the community, and that is a concern to me. One of the things I think the City Council has to start considering is the annexation of land. The status, the formation of a program for starter houses on a single-family lot, but a house that's restricted in size, which could be added onto later on or kept at a restricted size to keep the price tag down. I would call this as a starter house. The other thing is to require more employees to build housing for their employees. Not just Cottage Hospital, which is a big employer, but going down and looking at smaller companies, having them, and it's to their best interest to acquire a house to be an attractive for a future employee to live in. I look at the city right now at 73 years of age, and I see that we're at crossroads. And I'm not sure but what our roads aren't somewhat limited by the resources and the problems that we have in this committee. And I think that any decision that has to be made regarding any of these ordinances has to be thought out very, very carefully as to its full implications and results, because the future generations are going to live with that for many years. Thank you.
Mr. Ruchon, followed by Mr. Berry.
Thank you. As long as you're intent on pursuing the inclusionary measure, which apparently you are, if its true purpose is making a debt and housing affordability program, why not stop fooling around with these minor tweaks and really ramp up the percentage of the required inclusionary, ramp it way up. Even at 50% as a net workforce generator, this measure would barely tread water, and there are folks around here in this room that are a lot smarter than I am who can authentically claim that even at 50%, the thing would still be counterproductive. In other words, that the new market units would still generate more workforce sector needs than the project would house. Jacking up the percentage even up to 100% would be fine by me. There's almost universal agreement that our existing build-out and any additional build-out forced upon us by the state should be used to create affordable units. Here's a chance to make a meaningful step in this direction. I agree that such a move, ramping the thing way up, might have the temporary effect of shutting down building, but the eventual effect would be that the price of available parcels, those sitting unsold as a result, would come down to the point where affordable projects would be feasible. Remember that it's the land costs that's a key factor in precluding the affordable projects. In other cities, not so attractive as Santa Barbara, where land costs are reasonable, and the building and incidental costs are similar to ours, such projects do get built. So land costs are the key. Finally, please don't exempt the smaller projects. We should know by now, by experience, that the incremental effects of small development can soon outpace in their aggregate the effects of larger ones. Thanks.
Mr. Berry, followed by Jim Caldwell.
Hello, my name is Gil Berry. I had 5 brief points to make. First, I recommend that you exempt any project that has 100% units priced below the median price. In the staff report, it suggested exempting projects done by by employers for their workers. But if such projects that are 100% reasonably priced for the workforce are a good thing, why should they be limited to projects that are done by employers? If a private nonprofit, for example, who's not an employer, wanted to do a project where they're 100% units priced at $550,000, that should be exempt. Because when you have the affordable units, it forces the other units to be higher priced. So why have a project where you have 15% priced at, say, $300,000 and the other 85% priced at $1 million? So if anyone comes through, even a private developer that wants a project that has 100% of the units priced below the median price, like, for example, a condo at, say, $500,000 or $550,000, that's a good thing because it's providing workforce housing that we need. We don't need high-end units. We need the workforce units. So we should be encouraging such projects, not discouraging them. So I feel that that should be changed to any project and not just something that's 200% of the median. It should go a little bit higher than that. Not just a project that could be sold at $400,000. It should go all the way up to like maybe $500,000 or $550,000. My point number 2, you should exempt small mom and pop 2 to 4 unit projects because they just don't have the economy of scale that big projects do. And as an architect, I can tell you that they're just unfeasible almost as it is now. They just would be unfeasible to pay any in lieu fee. That there's such a difference in economy between the small 2 and 4 units and when you have the big projects that it's not even comparable. And also the big developers don't develop 2 to 4 unit projects generally. They usually do the big projects, and they have the money, they can pay the in lieu fee. But the small projects by the mom and pop, they don't have the money to pay the in lieu fee, and those in lieu fees, I would argue, are significantly high. Paying an $80,000 fee is significantly high. And once you get it in the books, every year it creeps up. You get this creep. Maybe it's $17,000 now. In a few years, it could be up to $40,000. Okay. Point 3 is the way it's written, it precludes 1 to 5 units from providing an affordable unit, only gives the option for an in lieu fee. You should revise that clause so if a developer of 2 to 5 units wants to provide the in lieu fee, you need to have that in there that he has the right to provide the to provide the affordable unit instead of paying the in lieu fee. And then number 4, it's silent as to a very common occurrence where you have one house on a big lot and the project consists of a lot split to create 2 lots out of the 1 lot. The project is that 1 new house. So it needs to be explicit when you have a lot split, which is 2 lots, the project's 1 new house, that is exempt, that the new house is not a project of 2. So that needs to be in there because that's a very common occurrence. And number 5, the entire ordinance should really be scrapped because of its unintended consequence. What we need is the workforce housing, like $500,000 units, $600,000 units. And the unintended consequence of this ordinance is it forces us to have 15% of like $300,000 projects, and then 85%, which would be 5 or 6 for every one, would be $1 million projects. So it has that unintended consequence of forcing the high-end projects that we don't need. And the other thing is that by having the projects sell or the units sell over $1 million, those aren't workforce people. They don't work at a gas station pumping gas or a dishwasher or a cook or a clerk in a store making $10 an hour. Those people don't buy the $1.2 million condos. So the idea is those people do need service. They need to have their hair cut by a barber. They go to a restaurant. They need a cook, a dishwasher. They get their gas pumped. They need their car mechanic. All those workforce. So it adds those people moving into town create a need for additional workforce, and those people would be commuting. So for every project you build, you're taking 1 commuter off for every 5 of the high-end people you're bringing in that create a need for more workforce to service them. So for every 1 person you're taking off the freeway, you're adding maybe 3 more service workers to come in from Ventura to provide service for the high-end people that move in. Thank you.
Mr. Berry, please, would you take a moment and just do number 4, just to summarize it once more. I kept with your logic and then I lost it.
Okay.
The lot split part.
Yes. It's fairly common to have 1 house on a big lot, and it's fairly common for people to split it into 2 lots. So for example, if the zoning is quarter acre and you have a half acre lot, you split it in half. Okay, now what the project is, it's a lot split of 2 lots. Now the 2 lots would not apply under 2 to 10 units because there's already existing 1 lot, there's existing 1 house. So the existing house stays, so the project consists of 1 new house on 1 new lot. But the way the ordinance is written, somebody can interpret it that since you're applying for a lot split of, to have 2 lots, and there'd be 2 houses, 1 in each lot, somebody could argue that there'd be an in lieu fee for the 2 units. Or maybe they argue that the 1 new unit should have an in lieu fee. But 1 new unit is 1 project. I mean, it's a project of 1 unit, therefore it's exempt from 2 to 10 units.
That clarifies it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Caldwell, followed by Mickey Flax.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My first premise on this, and I'm Jim Caldwell, by the way, speaking for the Government Relations Committee of the Board of Realtors. I agree with the prior speaker that this entire in lieu of as it exists right now should be scrapped, and I think that Plan Santa Barbara should take care of it. One of the issues that we have based on this current thing is the timing, and the timing is horrible in light of the current real estate market. And when you drop down into these 2 to 4 unit projects that many small developers are trying to create right now, which would create new housing, and many of them would be in the area of what is needed in Santa Barbara, adding on such fees as even the $17,000 per unit would create a situation where the project could go from profitable for a developer to being non-profitable. The end result is you're going to see a number of these projects scrapped. And I've seen a couple of that happen right now. In fact, we just sold one within our own office where it was going to be a new development, and when rumbles of this started coming into play, the project was scrapped. There's another one I'm aware of that's on that same threshold currently. So I feel really that what you're trying to create here is going to end, the end result is not going to accomplish what you're trying to produce with the fees. Thank you.
Mickey Flax, and that'll be our last speaker, unless anybody else gets in their speaker's card.
Hi, I'm Mickey Flax. I am on the Board of Commissioners of the County Housing Authority, but I'm speaking as an individual. I think there's no question about the need for moderate or upper moderate or whatever we call it, upper workforce housing. The units, those type of units that were available at Paseo Nuevo sold immediately, all 8 of them. Just as soon as the people qualified, they were sold. And there was a long waiting list and long application list. The need is not for so much for, or what we're discussing at least, is not the housing for the gas station worker or the clerk in the store. It is precisely for professionals of all kinds who do not make enough to buy market rate housing in this city of any kind, but who would like to live here and are not averse to living in condos and are not averse to living downtown, as the Paseo Nuevo experience has shown, and as people who came to the Plan Santa Barbara meetings that I attended said repeatedly. So I think there's no question that the need is there and the, quote, market is there. In terms of tweaking the ordinance, I understand the reluctance to go to a 10-unit project because that would trigger an EIR. On the other hand, I think that if we made it some intermediate step, like 6 to 8 units, would require a 6%, that would take it to 1 unit, and we would at least get the 1 unit without triggering an EIR. So I do agree that it should be, for the creation of a unit, it should be limited to 8%, to 6 to 8 units. Whereas for the payment of an in lieu fee, it should go from 2 to 9. I agree with that. The nonprofit exemption should definitely be in there, not just for employers, but it shouldn't be for any housing below the median. That would still be unaffordable to most of the income group that we're talking about. There should be an exemption for any housing that's sold at the price that's affordable to moderate or upper, which is about $250,000. Whether it's an employer or not who builds that housing, that they should be exempt. That's true. There are two purposes, I believe, to inclusionary housing ordinances. One, and this was triggered by a development down near the beach where all these units were being developed and there was no way existing to get anything affordable out of them. That's one reason. And this, the ordinance that we have and the ordinance that's being proposed continues that, especially if we allow a unit to be built when there are 6 to 8 being built. And the other, I think the other purpose of it is, in fact, to discourage what has become the law of the land around here, namely the conversion of rental housing into condos, high-priced condos. There is no way, as I understand it, that the city can specifically prohibit that. State law preempts it. So the state, and I get calls every day from people who say, what can I do? My landlord, I got a notice of eviction because my landlord wants to turn my apartment into a condo. And apparently we can't do anything directly, but an inclusionary ordinance requiring the payment of a fee, and a significant fee, for 2 to 6 or 8 or whatever it is units, I think would go some distance and is part of the purpose of an inclusionary ordinance. I was very happy to hear Mr. Rushin say that employer housing like cottage hospital housing is a good idea. Even though a lot of people in Allied oppose that housing, I do think it's a good idea. I think we need more employer housing. And we need other sources of income, and these fees may be the beginning of one of them, to build housing at this income level. There are no other funds available. Redevelopment money can't be used. Tax credit money can't be used. HUD money can't be used. There is no funding available. I don't believe the state bond money can be used. There is no direct funding available, housing funds, to build this kind of housing. And yet, this is precisely the kind of housing we need. So in order to find ways to do it, we have to go with things like inclusionary ordinances, which I do believe have problems. I don't think we need the 75% or 85% or whatever it is market rate housing needed to subsidize the inclusionary housing. I agree, we don't need that. But unless and until we can find another way to help subsidize the housing that we do need, then this ordinance, as it is the amendments recommended, I think is a good idea and we should continue it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public speakers? With that, we'll close public comment, and it's to the committee members. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Chairman Williams. We're fortunate in having...
Oh, let me ask one thing.
Sure.
If you want to do general comments first, I think that's fine, but then could we actually handle things in order of the staff report, which actually doesn't start with 1, it starts with 2, and maybe go down in order of that screen, but starting with 2, since the largest issue is lowering the threshold. But right.
As I was going to say, that we're very fortunate in having so many people from the public who are deeply concerned and very knowledgeable about this. In addition to the people who've spoken here today, I got plenty of emails on this topic, and I'm sure the rest of you did. I think staff did an excellent job in following council's direction on this, and of course I was not part of the council that directed that. I think another point that has been made by many people here today and also in emails is that the inclusionary housing ordinance did not accomplish what it was intended to, that it has many unintended consequences. And I agree that it is, if we decide as a city that we're going to give housing to people, it's grossly unfair to lay the burden for providing that on the very small number of people who buy new houses. So I certainly wouldn't support lowering the threshold. I think the ordinance was a mistake and should be scrapped.
But I would certainly be opposed to lowering it to 2 units. And, you know, just for an example, think about the council okayed a project a few weeks ago on the west side with 4 condo units with a target price of $600,000. How could it possibly be fair to the person who moves into that condo for $600,000 to tell them on top of what they had to do to get in there, they also have to give somebody else $17,700 so they can buy a house? It just doesn't make any sense. So since I don't agree with the idea of inclusionary housing, and I certainly don't agree with the idea of lowering the threshold any further, I think that's really all I need to say about this. Thank you.
Do you want to jump in first? Okay. All right. I just want to insert one thing into this argument, that there's a couple things that that I find amusing about this debate. One is that whenever the subject of adding community benefit extractions onto development comes up, then it seems that people who are arguing for the developer's side of things seem to forget basic economics. And we have market rate units are market rate, and they exist in a regional market. And if we add a $17,700 extraction on them, it is not possible for a developer in Santa Barbara simply to raise the price by $17,700. And this claim that is made so often just bothers me acutely, because it is your basic education in economics that you're forgetting, and it is the lack of understanding that this is a regional market, and as evidenced by recent projects that are withdrawing their applications, that sometimes when they cannot sell them for a certain amount, that means they just can't do them. And I agree that that's possible. So we get this weird situation where we have my fellow slow growthers come to the podium and dislike inclusionary housing because they hope if we get rid of inclusionary housing there will be less development. And then we have pro-growthers that come to the podium arguing against inclusionary housing because they hope there will be more development if we get rid of it. Both of those situations cannot exist at the same time. One of you must be right and one of you must be wrong. And so I think we need to wrestle with what we think those effects are going to be. And I would argue, whether or not you like inclusionary housing in general, that the changes recommended today make it more functional, in particular the lowering of the threshold to 2 units. Right now we have an inclusionary ordinance that is very strong for 10 units and above, but does not exist for 10 units for 9 units and below. And so guess what? We have a ton of people who come in and ask for 8 or 9 units. And is it fair to saddle the people with 10 or more units with all of the mission and yet exempt the people with 2 to 9 units from participating in this at all? Is it okay to allow the smaller projects, which are more often condo conversions and have minimal construction costs, to just sail on through without an extraction? I think those are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves today.
Okay, I want to just kind of go down the list here. The lowering threshold to 2 units, I agree with that. The big general comment I'll make is that the inclusionary ordinance approach was never intended to be the keystone to our whole affordable housing program. it was specific. I think at least one of the speakers, maybe a couple, hit the nail on the head. It addresses a particular situation that arises in the housing market, and that helps us meet a very important need, which is not being fulfilled by market forces. And this is an intervention, if you will. But this is there as one of many, many tools. In any case, lowering the threshold to 2 units, I support that. The approach of reducing the percentage that staff is recommending, I also support, because I don't want the fee to be onerous as it would have been with the previous calculation, especially on the smaller projects. This is a critical piece of it. Now, it's also very important because, as we know from our past, many of the projects, even the smaller ones, have been designed to try to get close to this range anyway, and even without us having an inclusionary requirement, many projects are approaching this range, and even occasionally will offer them rather generously in the process. So if anyone, whether it was an employer or not, were to come forward and offer an affordable unit in this range, I think they're off the hook for the in lieu. So that would be my comment on that. Certainly we want to be able to use the in lieu fees for the things that are suggested here. This is, again, filling a gap that has been, I guess we've learned from experience now, that's an unintended consequence. Our affordable housing program that we have now has such limits on the use of the funds that we really can't use them to administer or to have the flexibility that we would like to have, and this gives us the flexibility, so I support the staff's recommendations in 4. And I've already addressed number 5. I think that we've heard several times from people who've written to us and called, at least I've spoken to a couple of folks who have smaller projects that just don't have the cash flow to be able to come up with something like this fee that early as it would be with on an approval. But when you get close to the certificate of occupancy or at that latter phase, I think that's appropriate. And there they can get the two things that have a nexus. And then let me remember this one about the bedroom thing. Let me just see here for a second. Actually, Mr. Faustus, would you explain that again to me, please? Because I missed that somehow.
Yes, Councilmember House. It's actually a very minor point. The ordinance requires that the average number of bedrooms in the inclusionary units can't be less than the average number of bedrooms in the market rate units. And the idea is that if you have a project that's half 2-bedroom and half 3-bedroom, that the inclusionary units should reflect half 3 bedrooms and that. But sometimes a developer says, now, the way my project worked out, I'm doing 10 2-bedrooms and only 1 3-bedroom, and yet my 2 inclusionary units have to be 1 2-bedroom and 1 3-bedroom. Couldn't I do 2 bedrooms there? Wouldn't that be close enough? And currently, the ordinance doesn't allow any leeway, so it's just a way of.
Yes, I like that flexibility.
Just
so
a little more flexibility.
There's one of the staff recommendations that I had a little problem with, and that was the one called, eliminate the need for a lot area modification for the inclusionary units that receive a density bonus by entitlement. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I have a sense that, and maybe staff would like to respond, but one of the problems that we tend to have and has been brought to our attention is that in our zeal to get more affordable housing and to allow for the bonus density, we're also getting larger size projects that may be out of scale for the nearby neighborhood. And so this raises that flag for me. Any comment or idea on that?
Yes, I wonder if Jan Hubble can respond to that from the Planning Division.
Thank you, Stephen, and council members. The thing that's interesting is that for the inclusionary requirement, it says that the language in the ordinance already says that you have to grant the modification for that inclusionary number. And if you have to grant it, then why include that? Now, to answer your concern, Mr. House, regarding the concern about projects being too big.
The lot area modification that would go along automatically with that kind of a density bonus by entitlement.
The findings that you need to make to approve the tentative subdivision map that go with that also talk about consistency with the general plan, including things like neighborhood compatibility, issues of size, bulk, and scale. Those kinds of things can be handled through the findings for the map, not necessarily the finding for the modification. Because when you have to prove, if the only thing that's there is a lot area modification for the project, there's no basis for denying it if the inclusionary housing ordinance says you have to grant it. So it's actually put staff in a little bit of a quandary about why are you making findings for a modification that you have to grant for it to meet the inclusionary housing requirements anyway. Whereas if you don't have a modification for that, but you're looking at it in terms of the design guidelines and the general plan elements that talk about neighborhood compatibility, living within resources, size, bulk, and scale, and so on and so forth, we can look at it from that standpoint rather than focusing on the modification as the basis to do it.
Wouldn't the natural outcome of not let's just say if the modification were seen to be unsupportable, wouldn't that just make the project one unit smaller overall? I mean, that one market unit smaller, which would reduce everything else to be able to fit into the space that's.
I'm not sure that would actually be the outcome.
Okay, I just want us to continue this conversation. Maybe others on the committee. Those are all, by the way, those are all my comments with that one problem. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, to answer that last question, this is coming out of the inclusionary housing ordinance's incentive for bonus density units or for affordable units. It entitles the property owner, the applicant, to have additional market rate units, one for each of the affordable units they provide on site. That is what is making the density number increase. It does, and I would say that there are two different things going on how this applies. This applies in one way in an open field development. If you have open land, that it can't increase the project size. The property owner only owns so much land. It affects the number of housing units that can be put on that land. You take it to the same kind of scenario to a condo project. Again, property owner only owns so much land. Now, the question of how many units are put into the building that's ultimately approved there is a density question. The size of the building is a design review question, not affected by the inclusionary ordinance. The size of the building is something entirely separate and apart. What this is saying is, if you, as an applicant, come in with a project that is built to the zoning density allowed, your base density, and you add the required units on site, you're entitled to 2 more market units. It's a bonus density. It doesn't change the size of your project in the sense of the land area you have, but it can change or does change the number of units that are put into the project.
All right, that I understand. A lot area, please explain that. A lot area modification. If you had to request one, the reason for which you would have to request one is that you were going to put more development in terms of size into a lot than would be allowed by zoning. You'd be asking for a modification to be able to go into that space that was required by zoning to be left undeveloped. Am I correct with that?
That's correct.
So if we are saying that, yes, you may have more units because of the way this inclusionary is written, ordinance is written, it doesn't say that because you're allowed to have more units, you're allowed to expand past what the zoning would allow in terms of consumption of the lot for development. And what we're saying right here, if I understand it correctly, is that we would be taking away the need for a request for a modification. In other words, you could go into use more space than zoning would allow without having to request a modification.
Can I add to that? I think what Mr. Vincent's trying to say is that, let's take an example. We have a project that the density allowed on the site, and let's just not assume variable density and all that. But let's just assume that the project can have 20 units.
Okay.
And the inclusionary housing ordinance entitles them to 3 more units that are affordable.
Right.
That meet the inclusionary requirements. So they're allowed, therefore, to have 23 units on the parcel.
Right.
But the inclusionary ordinance presently also says, but you have to get a modification to do that, but you're also required to provide 3 of those units. Now, you could provide it within the 20 units, but then your density is reduced, your base density is now reduced to 17 units plus 3. And
I see.
so that's not really meeting what the goal necessarily of the inclusionary housing ordinance was intended. But the reality is that most of the time the problem with adding 3 more units to the project isn't so much that it's the additional units, it's that they've kept the unit sizes, particularly of the market units, larger than maybe they need to be. That's where we need to be focusing.
Well, this is what I've seen from being on Planning Commission. I saw over and again. It was surprising. Like, for instance, the affordable units were little studios, and the market rate units were maybe 2 bedrooms or so, but they're pretty large size. And had they been kind of forced to squeeze down the larger units, then they could have fit within the actual floor. The lot area that would have been allowed by zoning.
Well, it's not so much a lot area issue as it is the fact that, of course, one of the things we did to resolve the itty-bitty teeny tiny studio versus the large 2-bedroom unit was to do that thing where we require that the bedroom counts kind of match. But I think the other thing that we're going to need to look at as we move into more discussion of the multiple family requirements is looking at possibly maximum sizes of units or things like that if you're going to use variable density, or if you're going to go over a certain number of units and maybe minimum numbers of units that need to be built on a site as well, to make sure that people don't try to slide under to stay out of providing the inclusionary housing. And there's a lot of variables that play back into each other, but some of the concerns aren't so much really about the number of units as the size, bulk, and scale of the building that the units go into.
Well, I think where I come down on this, and I appreciate this conversation, is that if it were, to the developer's perspective, truly necessary in order to meet the inclusionary requirement that they go into use more of the lot than would be allowed by zoning, that they should actually request a modification. Otherwise, they should just scale the size of their other units down to be able to fit. And so I don't support the given that they should have the modification, or they should not have to request a modification in order to meet the requirement.
You're saying the size of the units, and the size of the units doesn't drive the modification. It's the
lot area
number
modification
of units.
Doesn't?
No, it's the size of the units does not drive the lot area modification. It's the number of units that drives the lot area
I thought lot area was
modification.
square footage.
Well, it's when you use variable density, yes, it is. But the thing is, it's what drives it is the number of units, because you're looking, and it's complicated because in this city we have variable density. But let's assume that we were in a city that didn't have variable density, and it just said that the maximum number of units per acre in this zone is 20 units per acre.
Okay.
And that's actually true in a few of our commercial zones where we just say 12 units per acre, period.
Right.
Where we don't allow the variable density approach. And so if you've got a 2-acre parcel and you can put 24 units, but under inclusionary it takes you up to 3.5, 4 units,
right,
then you are actually increasing the number of units per acre. It's not about the size of the building.
Oh, so the modification is required for, like, if we went instead of 12, I'm sorry, guys, it's just kind of important to me. So if we had 12 units per acre, and they're, and with 12 units, you would be allowed to have, you'd have to have another full unit, right? So it'd be 13 units. So now you'd have 13 units in that acre. That's what triggers the lot area modification?
That's exactly right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was that the actual size of the building was larger than would fit within the setbacks that were
Because the square
required.
footage of the units can go all over the place. It's that the total square footage of the building can change.
Okay, I just had a misunderstanding as to what lot area modification meant. I really thought it had to do with the square footage of the building, its footprint on the property.
Yeah.
Okay, well then I may be just fine with this one. All right, thank you.
For the sake of time, I'm going to start making motions. I'd like to make a motion to lower the threshold of the inclusionary housing ordinance to 2 units.
I'll second that, but do we have to do it this way? Or can we do all the ones you like and first?
Sure. If you would like to do that, let's just do straw polls on which to include. So lowering the threshold to 2 units. Are you supportive or opposed?
I support.
Oppose.
Okay, that's 2-1, so we'll include that in the final motion. Number 3, applying $17,700 per unit in lieu fees for 2 to 9 units. I'd be willing to raise that for higher than 4 units, but I'll go along with it to be a reasonable fella, depending on What do you think, Mr. House?
Well, I believe 2 to 9 is correct.
Okay. Then,
Well, I would actually go along, I mean, if we're going to try to get something useful out of this, I'd say 4 and above, because I really do think there is an issue here for the little mom and pop developer. You know, we're talking about people who run things on a shoestring.
I think we could take care of that by with the provision for the not delaying the in-lieu fee until occupancy for 2, 3, or 4 units. So support or oppose on number 3?
I support that.
Support?
Oppose.
Okay, that goes in the final motion. Allow in-lieu fees to be used for buying back units that are in default?
Support.
Support?
Sure.
Very constructive of you, Mr. Francisco. I support that as well. So 4A, or in support, subsidizing middle-income income and upper-middle-income housing for local employees.
Support.
Support. 4B, we're in support of paying for the staff costs for administrating the inclusionary housing program.
Support that.
I would support that if it was limited to a percentage, a reasonable percentage of how much is coming out of the inclusionary program. Any thoughts on that? Or you just want to support it or oppose it?
I'm okay with it as is.
Yeah, I am too. I really.
Okay. I'll go along with
the
go along with the majority. So
it's not that much money anyway.
4C, we're supportive of. 5, exempt middle-income units in employer-sponsored projects. I think we should change that to exempt middle-income units, no matter who.
In projects.
Yes.
I agree. I don't believe it has to be employer-sponsored, even though we want to encourage that. When anyone comes forward and is willing to do that, we should be appreciative.
Okay. So
and not penalize them.
That's unanimous?
Yeah.
And then number 6, for 2, 3, or 4 units, delay in lieu fee until occupancy. I think that's a good idea to give some relief to mom-and-pop operations. So that's unanimous. And 7, revised calculation of minimum number of bedrooms. I have a little bit of an issue for this. I think we should allow the community development director to change the minimum number of bedrooms per unit, but not the total number of bedrooms required. So meaning if a developer is willing to build us 2 one-bedrooms instead of 1 two-bedroom, I think we should be willing and able to do that, but we shouldn't reduce the requirement of how many bedrooms that a developer should be required to build. Any thoughts on that from committee members?
I didn't quite understand that. You support the idea of reducing the number that they have to?
What this is so that and correct me if I'm wrong, staff, the reason is so that we don't ask developers to build a bunch of 3 bedrooms when we really need a bunch of 2 bedrooms, or can you explain this further?
It's kind of a percentage approach is really what it amounts to. Is you end up with a project that's got 5 2-bedrooms and 3 3-bedroom, or 5. You've got 5 2-bedrooms and 6 3-bedrooms, and that means that the 2 inclusionary units that might be required you'd have to have 1 each of a 2-bedroom and 1 each of a 3-bedroom. No, it actually there would have to be 2 3-bedrooms is what would have to happen in that case when the developer's saying, well, that makes it a little tougher for me. I'm more than willing to do 2 more units, but I'd rather be able to split them evenly. And it's because of having that calculation just be off. It's especially a problem when you've got an uneven number of one or the other.
So my point is that would be 6 bedrooms that would be required in that case to be built. I don't think that we should reduce the amount of bedrooms required to be built. It should be 6 bedrooms, but we should allow in whatever form that they want to build it. If they wanted to build 3 2-bedroom units instead of the 2 3-bedroom, I think we should allow
and that ends up increasing the inclusionary requirement.
Right, and my point is that is what we should allow flexibility in.
And at that point, that would call for a lot area modification because we would be over the inclusionary requirement.
Well, you convinced me on the lot area modification, but we'll get that after this. So,
okay,
do you understand my point here?
Yeah,
that we should
do.
be counting bedrooms like variable density does instead of counting units.
Yeah, I guess I'm concerned about this when we're getting, here's the thing, when we're getting into these smaller projects, it's already a big deal when we have this, this in lieu fee for each of the, units.
But this won't be for the smaller projects, because the smaller projects won't build anything. This is the projects that we're already seeing. The smaller projects will be
the 7,
paying
8,
the
or
in lieu
9
fees.
you're talking about?
This will be generally 10 unit and above projects.
Actually, this is for the entire ordinance. This isn't just for the smaller. This is on what we're talking about right here applies to 10 and above as well. Am I?
The minimum number of bedrooms
Right.
in the units, it would primarily apply to 10 and above, because that's where there would actually be a requirement for building the units. So.
Okay, this is a tough one. I think I go along with you, Mr. Williams. I think but I just had my concern was more on the smaller projects where that extra size in a small lot or whatever, the whole thing becomes like a super major burden, and I don't want that to be. I want this to continue to be doable. So your suggestion is that you take the average of the number of bedrooms in the rest of the project, you apply it to the inclusionary, but you can distribute them however you want in the
Right, so that we allow the community development director flexibility in units, but not in number of bedrooms required.
I think effectively that will mean no change.
I think that's true.
Unless a developer wanted to, instead of doing 2 3-bedrooms, to build 3 2-bedrooms, which occasionally you have somebody who wants to help the community more, and that will do that. I guess.
I think they'll do that. They'll just decide to do that in particular circumstances. But
you don't need the community development director's discretion for that?
Right.
I thought you would, because then you would increase the inclusionary.
That would be actually a planning commission decision, because because now instead of let's go back to the idea that we're not talking variable density at this moment, so we're not dealing with bedroom count for the lot area mod. But if they, if their inclusionary requirement is 2 units and they're actually going to provide an inclusionary of 3, that 3rd unit, not being part of the inclusionary housing requirement, does require a lot area modification that is discretionary on the part of the Planning Commission, as opposed to the ones that are required under the inclusionary, which is not discretionary unless they deny the whole project.
All right, then I guess I'm just against allowing the community development director flexibility. So what do you guys say? Are you supportive or oppose the community development
I hate
director?
these kinds of things. I guess that's why we're on the ordinance committee, is to resolve these stupid things. I like the flexibility. You're going to watch me going back and forth on this one because it's so tough. But I really like that there's some flexibility in it. I mean, and if I understand this correctly, this would be something that the community development director could makes a judgment call on, right? In other words, looks at the project and says, these guys trying to get away with something with like 3 studios and everything else is 4 bedrooms. Community development director says, no, you may not do that. You've got to be close, right?
Right.
Okay. I go with the flexibility that's recommended by staff.
I oppose it.
Okay. So you're against the flexibility? Okay. So that's 2 votes against it, so it will not be in the final.
Not a good all my perseverating did.
And then we'll call it number 8, eliminate the need for a lot area modification for inclusionary units.
I support it based on staff's explanation.
I support it too. You convinced me. I didn't support it beforehand. Mr. Francisco? Sure. Okay. Thank you. And then finally, back to number 1, revise in lieu fees for projects of 10 units and above to be from $400,000 and some change to $300,000 and some change.
And Mr.
I'm
Williams,
incredibly ambivalent on this.
Actually, the in lieu fee would be the same in lieu fee for projects of any size. It's just that for under 10 units, it would be prorated. So it's a question of whether we change the calculation across the board or not.
I'll weigh in on that. I think that the changing across the board is a good thing. We're not getting anything. We're either getting a additional unit, which is great, but there's some situations, especially in the ones that are like 11 units or so, that we might be able to do better with the money. And to make it more likely to get the money, I think it could be a good thing. So it makes the decision more of an equitable decision. So I support that.
Mr. Francisco?
I support it.
Okay, I guess I'll go along. Can I get a motion on the totality of the recommended
I move
changes?
to recommend these changes that we just discussed and that were supported by 2 of the 3 of us to City Council.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No.
Motion carries. Recommendation to council. Does anybody want to make any parting comments?
I had a question.
Sure, Mr. Paulstich.
Mr. Chair, that would mean that we would take a recommendation of the ordinance committee as drafted just now back to council for basically a straw vote or a vote on whether to come back to ordinance committee for the actual drafting of the ordinance. And that sounds like a good idea to me in light of the fact that we need 5 votes in order to, and if it turns out that there aren't 5 votes at council, then there's no reason to draft the changes to the ordinance.
Yes.
So, okay, thank you.
I would say one thing that Mr. Francisco, why don't you go first? Can you tell him to maybe move the birthday party? Mr. Francisco?
Just very briefly, I guess I have a different understanding of basic economics, and the costs of production, as I understand it, are always factored into the price that something sells for. And it doesn't matter whether it's an increase in the value of land, the cost of cement, or the increase in a government extraction. That's going to be factored into the price.
That would only be possible if the extraction was equal throughout the entire market area, and given the fact that we have people buying houses from the East Coast, that would not be possible. But I think, Mr. Francisco, we probably don't want to get into economics debate at 10 till 2. My feeling is 2 things. This is more important than anything else. This closes a loophole that has, in my opinion, caused a great deal of market redevelopment to middle-income neighborhoods like the Bungalow Haven without any mitigation or extraction for the benefit of the community as a whole. And so I really hope that what we are doing here today can lead to the council really taking a stand on this issue. The second part of that, of course, is in dealing with the issue of condo conversions and the loss of rental housing. And this is the first meaningful step towards handling that. And because RENA numbers were mentioned, I also just want to say that from my perspective, the city of Santa Barbara will build housing for the income levels that Santa Barbara's need housing for, not for what income levels and in what amount the state tells us to. We'll do it because it's the right thing, not because of what the state tells us to do.
Mr. Williamson, you gave me this chance. The condo conversion ordinance, thank goodness, does help renters, and it puts them in a better spot if they have to move along. And I'm very, very grateful to you and to others for initiating that and carrying that forward. But I really do believe that this inclusionary deal is a little tiny piece of the larger affordable housing and workforce housing discussion. It's not intended, not anyway intended to be the be-all, end-all for affordable housing. And most of the affordable housing that we've gotten in Santa Barbara has not been because we forced it. It happens because people who are developing their properties are building to meet the needs of the community and mixing up incomes on their properties, and much more than we require. Over and over again, we've seen that. And so I'm very grateful also to the development community for stepping up over and over again and not having to have their arms twisted to get us the kind of housing that we need. So anyway, there's a lot more to the discussion, and Plan Santa Barbara is where that should take place.
Meeting adjourned.